In this video, we're going to study how scientists classify the world, how they organize all the diversity of life that exists. And so this is chapter 1, part 2. Hopefully you've been reading or are currently reading chapter 1 of the biodiversity unit. So taxonomy is the science of naming, identifying, and classifying species as we discover them. Today, taxonomy follows something called the binomial nomenclature and naming system. We basically provide organisms with a two-name system or a two-part name to make it very easy and universal to understand. The old taxonomic system, which means the old organization system, focused mostly on morphology, so similarities in physical features. But as we know, that's not necessarily the best way to do it these days, because some of the similarities could be analogies. So you might look at these two organisms and think that they're more closely related to each other than, let's say, this organism here, than they are to this organism. However, we know that based on DNA evidence and other evidence that we did research with, we actually know that the barnacles, which are these ones here, are more closely related to the crab than they are to the limpets, which are these ones over here. So we don't always stick with morphology anymore. As we get more information, we sometimes reclassify things. So that's important to understand as we go through this unit. Remember that we also used to identify species based on how they reproduced using the biological species concept. But remember that that's not always the best case, because there are some organisms that are asexual, so they wouldn't reproduce sexually. There are some organisms that no longer exist, and so you can't see how they reproduced and what they would reproduce with. So oftentimes we have to go with other methods, which we may have seen, such as the phylogeny methods, using DNA evidence, molecular evidence, wherever possible. And again, that leads to reclassification in many cases. So this over here is Carl Linnaeus, and he is known as the father of taxonomy. He started to place organisms into different groups based on similarities. So he would look at their morphology, their physical features. He would look at where they mostly on their physical features, and he placed them into this group called genera. These groups called genera, or singular genus, and that's a taxonomic level. It's basically a group within an organization system. And today it's more complex than this. We'll go over that in more detail in just a bit. He also came up with the idea of binomial nomenclature, which means giving an organism a two-part name, a scientific name that's easier to understand for everyone. Binomial nomenclature is very, very useful, especially compared to the long name that we used to use traditionally. So for example, this here is Rosa canina. The traditional name was Rosa sylvestris inodora su canina, which is very, very long. So the two-part name, much more useful, and not so much of a mouthful compared to the long traditional name over here. So as mentioned, Carl or Carolus Linnaeus is the one who came up with the binomial naming system, binomial nomenclature. So it's a two-part Latin name, and the two parts are the genus and the species. So the genus is always written with uppercase first letter, and everything else following it is lowercase. If you are typing it out, everything needs to be italicized. If not, you underline everything if it's handwritten. So here we have Panthera pardus. This is the binomial name for the leopard. So Panthera is the genus, pardus is the species. And notice uppercase and then italicized. Now in the two-part name, the genus is usually the thing that tells you if two organisms are related or similar to each other in certain characteristics. The species name is more arbitrary. It's based off certain things about the creature. So for example, if we look at A, the scientific name for this red oak over here is Quercus rubra. So Quercus means that it's an oak tree. So all oak trees are Quercus. So as soon as your Quercus is oak tree, the rubra part means it's red. So if two organisms share the same genus, then you know that they have something in common. They're part of some major category. So for example, you can see over here we have the lemur is Varechia rubra. That rubra part, you'll notice, is common to the lemur and the tree, yet they're not super closely related. So that species name just goes to show that this is based off an arbitrary feature, like the color, for example. So you really want to look at the genus when determining some general belonging to a group. So again, same genera would mean that they have similar characteristics. So we can look at Ursus americanus and Ursus maritimus. The Ursus is meaning that they are part of this bear group. Americanus just means that it's a black bear. Maritimus means it's a polar bear. Sometimes common names are a bit dangerous. So if we look at the koala bear, it's not really a bear. Look at its species name. We have Phascolarctos cinereus. So you can see there's no Ursus part to it. So it doesn't share many features with the Ursus genera. So this koala bear is actually a marsupial, which is very, very different from bears that you're actually familiar with. It's actually more closely related to kangaroos than it would be to bears. So right here, we're kind of getting into the idea that koala bear, the common name for this thing here, is a bit misleading because it's more closely related to kangaroos than it would be to actual bears. Marsupial meaning pouched organisms like the kangaroo. So in addition to binomial nomenclature, Carl Linnaeus came up with this this hierarchy, this ordering system. So in this ordering system, what we have listed is basically a hierarchy from general to specific. So you have a kingdom. A kingdom contains many organisms, and you can take a few organisms from that kingdom and place them into a separate phylum. And then you can take a few organisms from the phylum and put them into a class. You can take organisms from that class, put them into an order. Even fewer organisms, put them into a family, then into a genus, and then into a species finally. So these different groups here, or categories of organization, they are called taxa, or plural taxon. So kingdom is a taxon, a very general, broad one. Phylum is a taxon, class, order, family, genus, and species. And so you need to know the order of these taxa from general, starting at the kingdom, to most specific, ending at the species here. And so you can see this over here. Here we have the kingdom contains many organisms, so we're in the animal kingdom over here. And then we can take a few organisms in the chordata phylum, so they have a spinal cord. And then afterwards, we can take a few organisms from the class, or from the phyla, and they can be part of the same class, so mammals. We can take some mammals that are part of the carnivores, and we can put them in the order Carnivora. We can be even more specific and take a small subset of these and put them into the same family, so Felidae. We can then take a smaller subset, so these two here, and put them in the same genus, Panthera. And then finally we get to the species. So notice how we go from general to specific as we go from kingdom to species. Again, here you can see the classification system we've been discussing throughout. So you can see you're in the animal kingdom. You can take a few organisms, so not the starfish, and go into the chordata phylum. And then you can take a few organisms, so not the snake, and go to the mammal class. Then you can take a few organisms, so not the squirrel, and then go into the order of the carnivore. And then you can go take a few organisms, so not the fox, and go into the Ursidae family. Then you can take a few organisms, so not the panda over here, and go into the genus Ursus. And then finally you can have the species Ursus arctos. So Ursus is the genus, and then Arctos is the species. And so we get more and more and more specific as you go from kingdom to species. Here you can see the classification, the taxonomic classification for humans. So we are Homo sapiens. That's our scientific name. So we have the animals. That's our kingdom. We are part of the chordates. We are part of mammals. We are primates. We are hominids family. Our genus is the Homo, so hominids with upright posture and large brains. And finally, we are the species sapiens. So there are other species of there are other Homo genus out there. You could have Homo erectus, for example. Now they don't exist anymore, but there's fossil evidence of their existence in the past. The Neanderthals, also part of the genus Homo, but different species. So their characteristics are different, and that's why they would be placed under different species. So again, you should know the taxonomic classification order, and you should know it specifically for humans as well. That would be very, very important for you to know. take a look at this picture here. There's a little mistake in it. See if you can find it. Hopefully you've been paying attention throughout and you can spot it. So we have the 7 layers of classification, or the 7 taxa. You should know them: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. There are some tricks that you can come up with in order to determine, in order to remember this in that specific order. One good mnemonic that you can use is this one here: king, kingdom; philip, phylum; comes, class; over, order; for, family; great, genus; soup, species. So that's a mnemonic, a memory aid that you can use to remember the taxa from the most general to the most specific. Here we have some examples of taxonomic organization and classification for different species: the gray wolf, the honeybee, and the red oak. Using this, you should be able to come up with their 2-part name. For example, for the gray wolf, I would say it's Canis lupus. For the honeybee, you can try it out first. That's right, Apis mellifera. For the red oak, try it out first. Pause, try it out. Okay, Quercus rubra. So you should be able to use this classification method in order to provide a taxonomic classification for an organism. And then you can try the concept checks over here and the practice problems in the next few slides. Now, one thing that's important to understand is that there's a lot of diversity out there. And taxonomists have been discovering more species, and because there's so many species out there, we actually had to come up with intermediate taxonomic levels. And for example, we have superorders, subfamilies, just because there's so many different organisms that exist. So not only do we have family, but we have subfamily within the family as well. So we can divide the taxa that we see here today. In our course, we're going to focus mostly on the main ones that you see in this presentation, but do understand that there are things like superorders and subfamilies that you can use as taxa as well. A very interesting thing, some organisms that led to intermediate taxa are the insects. Insects are actually the most diverse of the groups of animals that exist. So they're so diverse that we had to create the intermediate taxa in order to classify the insects. And you can see here more than half of all named species are insects. Quite interesting. And they are super important, even though sometimes they might be icky gross. They are super important for our ecosystems. Great practice problems to do here. Please make sure you practice these and compare with your peers to see that you're on the right track. More practice problems here. As mentioned before, genus is the unique part. It's the part that really shows that organisms share some kind of features in common. They're part of the same group of some sort. Remember that we did use morphology for many organisms, so there could be some mistakes. Now we are trying to base our classification using some DNA evidence, using more of that homology. We're trying to relate these organisms based on their common ancestor. We're not perfect, we're not there yet, we do make mistakes, but as we discover new things, we can always change our classification system. So again, previously taxonomy was mostly based on morphology, but that can be dangerous because a lot of these similar features could be due to convergent evolution. So today, we're going to try to focus more on phylogeny, which means that we try to put organisms together based on their sharing of a common ancestor using better evidence. But again, it's not always possible. Here we can see phylogenetic tree using morphology. Scientists used to think that the red pandas and giant pandas were more closely related to each other than this relationship that you see here. But after doing some DNA evidence, we actually realized that the raccoons and red pandas are more closely related to each other, and the giant pandas and the bears are more closely related to each other than the other way around. And of course, they all share a common ancestor. Here we can see our summary of the different taxa that we've been studying. So the kingdom can be divided into phyla, phylum singular. The phylum can be divided into classes. A class can be divided into orders. Orders can be divided into families. Family into genera or genus, and then genus into species. So this is our taxonomy and phylogeny combined. So if you take a look, the more general taxa are typically the common ancestors that you might see. And the tips of the trees, they would be the species that we're studying when we combine taxonomy and cladograms in phylogenetic trees. So for example, we can see that there's a common ancestor of the order carnivore. That's a common ancestor to all these organisms up here. That carnivore led to Felidae family, Mustelidae family, Canidae family, and then that family led to the Canis genus, the Lutra, Mephitis, and Panthera genus, so the genera rather. And then within those you have the different species that have developed over time. So essentially your common ancestors are your more general taxa, whereas the species at the tips are more specific. And again, it's very important that you understand that traditional focused on structural data, whereas phylogenetics focused on more evidence, such as biochemical evidence, fossil evidence, some structural data as well, but more legit evidence. Did I just say legit? I think I did. More reliable evidence rather than something that was convergent. And so that leads to some changes in the way we viewed our traditional cladograms, in the way we viewed our relationships. So essentially, organisms, when we first started classifying them, we used to place them into two groups. We either said they were plants or animals. We used to think fungi and algae were considered plants because they had cell walls. And we actually used to think bacteria were also part of plants because they had cell walls. But today, we don't only have two kingdoms. We actually have 6 kingdoms. So we went from a 2-kingdom classification system to a 6-kingdom classification system as we became more sophisticated at classifying organisms using different features. So today our tree of life looks more like this here. We have a common ancestor, and then we have a whole bunch of branches that split off. So the organisms are all classified into 6 different kingdoms: plants, animals, fungi, protists, archaea, and eubacteria. Sometimes we just call these bacteria. So these are the 6 different kingdoms in which we organize life. We came a long way from the time that we used to organize life into plants and animals only. Much simpler. This is more complex, but also more accurate because we have more evidence to compare them with. So these are our kingdoms. Make sure you know what the kingdoms are. Make sure you understand that life, all life shares a common ancestor, and we all split off into those 6 different kingdoms. Now this is a simplification: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different kingdoms. But it's actually more complex than that because those kingdoms each split off into other different phyla. And those phyla can split off into other taxa, so on and so forth, until you get to the species at the tips. So this is our famous table of the different kingdoms. You need to know these kingdoms. You need to know general ranges of how many species there are. You need to know cell features, other important characteristics, and representative organisms. The only way to know that is for you to study it, not for me to say it. You need to go read it, you need to study it, and you need to focus on these. So again, all organisms share a common ancestor. This is the original cell here. And over time, there were changes through macroevolution that led to these different kingdoms that we see here today. Now, one thing you'll notice about these different kingdoms is that there's one that seems like a little bit scattered. The protists, you'll notice that they're a bit scattered in terms of their organization. So you have these groups here that are part of animal and fungi, and then some random one over here that just goes into protist. You have this group here that's part of plant, and then all of a sudden these ones here are part of the protist section. So protist seems to be taking organisms from different common ancestors and clumping them into this kingdom called protist. We'll talk about protist in more detail later on. Right now I just want to add one more taxon. So above kingdom, even more general than kingdom, is something called the domain. So life is actually organized into 3 domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Bacteria is divided into the kingdom bacteria. Archaea is divided into the kingdom archaea. Eukarya is divided into plant kingdom, protist kingdom, fungus kingdom, and animal kingdom. So domain is actually our most general taxon of all. And then we go into kingdom, and then we get more and more specific as we go down. So this was discovered using DNA evidence, and so this was added later on to the Carl Linnaeus classification system. So in reality, now we have 8 taxa: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And so if you wanted a new trick to remember that, dumb King Philip came over for great soup. So domain, eukarya for eukaryotic organisms. Those are the organisms that have a nucleus that surrounds their DNA. And so if you're not quite sure what a eukaryotic cell is, please take a look at the Biodiversity Part 3 video, as there's some information about the eukarya domain. So here we can see that all of life is divided into one of 3 domains, either bacteria, archaea, or eukarya. And then within those domains, there's further divisions. For example, in eukarya, you have your protists, your plants, your fungi, your animals. And then within there's even more divisions that occur as well. Now, the thing with protists I just want to mention is that it's not really accepted anymore. Protists are kind of everywhere. You can think of protists almost like the everything drawer. Things that we're not too sure of, where they belong, are they fungus, plant, or animal, we just throw them into protist for now. And as more evidence is acquired, then we can place them into a proper kingdom. We're actually dividing protist up into a few different kingdoms, and that's what we're heading to in a bit. So this is our tree of life, common ancestor, 3 domains. Within the domains, we have even further divisions. And this is our simplified tree of life here. All living things, domain bacteria, domain archaea, domain eukarya. Eukarya splits into these kingdoms over here. And then archaea is just archaea, and bacteria, bacteria. And then, like I said, these split into more things, these split into more things, these split into more things, more things, more things, more things, and more things. Here we can see a summary of our different domains and different kingdoms. And here we can just see a little summary of protist, how they're breaking down. So you'll notice we have our ancestral eukaryote over here, a eukaryotic domain. And we have our plants, our fungus, and our animals. But you'll notice that these common ancestors don't quite belong in all one area. Some of the protists are actually more closely related to animals than they are to other protists. Some of the protists are more closely related to fungi than they are to other protists, and some of the protists are more closely related to plants than they are to other protists. So what that means is that our protist classification system is not the greatest so far. It's not a true clade. It's actually paraphyletic, which means that it's really only an ancestor and some of its descendants. So you can do this practice problem here, but what I want you to realize from this practice problem is that the protist kingdom is going to be divided into 3 smaller kingdoms, and maybe even more than that. So we went from a 2 kingdom to a 5 kingdom to a 6 kingdom to an 8 kingdom system. We are studying the 6 kingdom system right now, but eventually we'll move on to an 8 one when you study this in university. In the 5 kingdom system, this is something I started off teaching. The eubacteria and archaea were under one kingdom called Monera, and now we just have them divided into these 2 kingdoms instead. These are the practice problems you should work on from the Nelson textbook. Make sure you do your readings. Make sure that you are looking through the tables and memorizing specific examples. The only way to really be prepared for this test, this quiz, these assessments is to do some continuous reading, continuous studying, because there is a lot to know here. It's not difficult, it's just memory work. And there is a great article I want you to read on how we come up with scientific names for different organisms using the genus and the species. There's a couple of rules I want you to read up on, so you should know the rules for coming up with scientific names. If you read the article, you'll know why. I have a picture of Donald Trump here and some weird bug that looks like him. When I expect you to read articles, I don't want you to memorize every single thing from those articles. I want you to get the gist of the article, so what it was about naming species, and the rules for coming up with scientific names. I would focus on what those rules are for coming up with scientific names, what you can do and what you cannot do.